Good evening and welcome everyone to our third lockdown learning conversation. My name is Bren Carlil and I am the Public Affairs Director at the Zionist Federation of Australia. I hope everyone is having a very peaceful and very healthy Pesach and that your Seders the other night, if quiet, were lovely. And for those celebrating Easter today, I hope today is a truly special date for you and your family. I am really looking forward to tonight's conversation. Our guest tonight is Dov Lipman. Dov is an ordained rabbi and a former member of Knesset for the largely secular Yesh Party. He's the author of 7 books on Judaism and Israel. He has been at the forefront of combating religious extremism in Israel and is a leader in efforts to create Jewish unity, both in Israel and around the world. He's also a columnist, a regular TV guest, and a senior manager at Honest Reporting. Many of you will remember Dov from his 2016 visits to Australia. He'll be speaking tonight about the implications of COVID-19 on Israeli politics, about religious secular relations, and about the meaning of Pesach as a festival of national liberation when Jews have been nationally liberated. Ultimately, though, we'll let the conversation wander where it takes us. Dov will be speaking tonight with someone who needs absolutely no introduction for anyone who lives in Melbourne. Ginette Searle is the CEO of the Zionist Federation of Australia. Beyond that, she and her husband, John, have been pillars of the Melbourne Jewish community for many years. And she is, I say without a hint of self-interest, a really nice person and a great boss. Now, before I start, we at the ZFA think that the lockdown learning conversations have been really valuable, and the feedback we're getting seems to reflect that. So if you think that these conversations are valuable, I encourage you to share right now this live video feed onto your own Facebook pages. That will mean that all of your Facebook friends will see that it's on and have the chance to see Ginette and Dov in conversation. Now, due to the end of Pesach, we won't be having a midweek lockdown learning conversation. However, we will be having one this time next Sunday, and the theme next week will be Yom HaShoah, which falls this year on April the 21st. So as always, please add any comments or questions to the Facebook comments and I will make sure that Dov and Ginette see them. But other than that, without further ado, Ginette.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Bren. Good afternoon to you, Dov, and good evening to everyone else here in Australia and perhaps beyond, and to this edition of the ZFA's Lockdown Learning Series. Dov, welcome back to the ZFA. You're a friend of ours, you've been here before and you know our community. Welcome to this time to our living rooms across the country. And for those of you watching live, please let us know where you're watching from by commenting on the Facebook stream. So Dov, Mo'adim L'Simcha, first of all. We're right in the middle of Pesach, our festival of national liberation. Dov, you're not just an educator, a political analyst and a commentator, but you're also a rabbi. So tell us, please, how do we reconcile the notion of celebrating our freedom?
Which was enforced. No one could go anywhere. And that was really, really difficult, that people didn't have the opportunity to travel to their grandparents and grandparents to grandchildren, etc. Everyone adhered to it because, first of all, it was enforced by the police and by the military. There were warnings that went out. Naftali Bennett in particular put out warnings about if you go to your grandparents, you think you're doing a positive thing, you could actually, God forbid, be causing them tremendous, tremendous harm. There was even a advertising campaign put out by the Ministry of Health that said, Kadesh o Kaddish. Are you going to be singing Kadesh or Chatz with your families? Or are you going to be saying Kaddish, God forbid, for someone who's going to pass away? And it was very effective. Obviously, that initially felt like a very difficult move, and we couldn't imagine what it would be like to celebrate the Seder without the extended families, without the guests that we usually would have. But I want to separate for a moment those who were literally by themselves, literally someone sitting by themselves with any other experience. I can tell you for us, it was my wife and myself together with 3 of our children. It was a joy. We sat, we talked, deep thoughts, we sang. We didn't have the guests that we usually are entertaining and explaining things to, which we missed, but there was something very special about experiencing this just with the nuclear family. And I know that couples as well, older couples who've never experienced this in their entire marriage, 50 years of marriage, and they're saying it was really beautiful to sit together and experience the Seder. But in Israel, we were very concerned about especially people who were completely alone. That's a thought which, again, my mind can't even comprehend. But I have many people that I know who are by themselves. So there was a call that at 8:30 at night, everyone should go to their porches and together, collectively, sing the Manish Tana. And I posted that on Facebook, and there was definitely curiosity, would this actually happen or not? I can tell you, Ginette, it was a chills as we went out to our porch. Everyone else came out to their porches, and you literally heard Manish Tana echoing off the buildings. I didn't want to even sing because I just wanted to hear it and take it in and experience it. It was extremely, extremely powerful. I actually posted on my Facebook page and my profile a video which shows there are certain areas where people video this happening, and you get a sense for what it was like. And earlier that night, we actually had prayers outside as well, everybody on their porches. And I had the great merit of being the Chazan and to call out Hallel, and then to hear from buildings all around, people I couldn't even see it sometimes, people responding. It was really special. And I hope for those people who were alone in particular, that it made them feel like they were part of something. And I think that for Israel, it was such a unifying moment. It was religious and secular, Sephardic and Ashkenazic, people from all backgrounds, but this unifies us together. And we had that really special moment, which we would never have had if we just continued Pesach as usual. And now we've had that experience. I'm already thinking to myself, next year, when God willing, things get back to normal, we're all going to want to go out to our porches again at 8:30 to experience that unity. And I hope that we do continue that tradition.
It's beautiful. I saw the little cartoon post that you put out on Wednesday morning, our time, I think. We also posted it on our Facebook. It got a lot of attention. And like you, I was wondering whether it would actually happen. So it's lovely to see that it did and to hear that it did. Sounds like the best street party, and what an incredible experience. But still must have been quite a difficult experience for so many people, as we know, both in Israel, in Australia, all around the world. It's been a big challenge, but I love how you're putting it in a futuristic kind of perspective of we have a lot to gain out of this experience. And I think the more that we can take from that and build into our lives, the better we'll come out the other end with, please God, soon. That's on the plus side. There've been a lot of beautiful creative initiatives coming out of Israel, coming out of all over the world, I suppose, musically and culturally and spiritually, as you've talked about. On the minus side, we've seen some flouting of the rules, quite high prominent flouting of the rules. Can you comment on some of the highs and the lows, perhaps, Dov?
Absolutely. The most difficult situation that we had in Israel related to the Ultraorthodox community, where because Israel was really ahead of the curve on this in terms of the rules, social distancing. It was very early on, rules about people going into quarantine, cutting down on flights. And the goal was really to try to nip this in the bud and to keep it contained as much as possible. There was, especially in the Ultra-Orthodox community, but there were other communities as well, where it took time for the rules to be adhered to, specifically in the Haredi community, the Ultra-Orthodox community. I think there was a significant gap in terms of the information flowing to the leaders, because the one thing that I know is that life is, especially for the more religious you are, life is the highest value. In fact, the command is that with the exception of 3 cardinal sins, we violate every transgression in the Torah to preserve one life. So certainly, if there's a real risk to people's lives, of course we would forego on synagogue and on schools and things which are important, but don't measure up to protecting lives. But the rabbis who were initially giving the rulings, it was not presented to them in that way. I saw video footage of how it was presented to them, and they said, no, God forbid, don't close schools, don't close the shuls, because it was just presented as some kind of a futuristic, who knows what, a theoretical, I would say, situation. As it became known and recognized how serious it was, the rabbis certainly came down very hard and even said, if one violates the rules, they're what's called a rodef. They're a pursuer who has to be turned into the authorities immediately. So it took time, and sadly, that time is costing people's health and it seems people's lives as well. You also have another element, which is the ultra-Orthodox community as a whole being very disconnected from the internet and flow of information even on their own. And that caused a real lag as well. Now, again, there were other places also where we saw people at the beach and groups in all populations where people weren't keeping to it, but especially in the ultra-Orthodox population where you have, thank God, but you have large families, people living in very close quarters, the ability for the virus to spread very quickly was in place. And sadly, we're seeing Bnei Brak as an example, neighborhoods in Jerusalem, even some neighborhoods where I live in Beit Shemesh, where you're seeing much higher percentages than the rest of Israel. Sadly, we do have fanatics, and these are small little pockets who even as of now are not adhering to the rules, and they're not listening to any rabbi who's telling them otherwise. The police are doing their best to try to crack down on that. I think at this point, we're catching up, and we're even starting to see, hopefully, things being contained. But again, we've seen the deaths now go over 100 in Israel. Very, very tragic. We're seeing a huge number of cases throughout Israel. But the authorities are saying that they're hoping that we're getting to a point where we're peaking and maybe things will be able to be brought down again. I can tell you my son, who served in the army in the past, was called up to reserve duty to be part of a checking station where they're setting up throughout the country for people who are feeling the symptoms, because the goal is to get as many people checked as possible. And that's especially happening in the ultra-Orthodox areas. I will say, Ginette, though, that even though we had that difficulty with the ultra-Orthodox community, there have been some really beautiful calls, both from political leaders, rabbinic leaders, even on the secular side, for people to say, this is not a moment for anti-ultra-Orthodox rhetoric. This is not a time to speak out against an entire community when huge percentages are keeping to the rules. And I'm hoping, this is always my optimistic perspective on things, but with all that we're dealing with, that there will be some changes that will take place as a result. For example, the reporting in Bnei Brak, 50% increase in requests for connection to the internet. People who understand they need to be cued in, they need to hear what's happening. I do believe there's going to be some reassessment about how the system works with the rabbis who make the rulings, and the whole community listens to it, making sure they get real information so they can make their rulings the right way. I will also point everyone, though, to Times of Israel, a column written by Rabbi Menachem Bombach, who's a Haredi leader. And the column, I believe, is called no, we're not criminals. You know, we want to be part of Israeli society as well, and we're trying very hard. You know, yes to unity, no to criminals. Don't call us criminals. Let's try to work together on this, and hopefully we'll see that attitude throughout Israel as we get through this difficult, challenging time, especially regarding the ultra-Orthodox population.
Mm. I hear your very positive outlook and the optimism there. But obviously today it's still a point of tension. Do you think, and I know, Dov, you've been quite an advocate for bridging the divide between secular and religious in Israel, and all credit to you for that. Do you think that there's a risk that the religious secular relations in Israel, and for that matter abroad, will deteriorate during and potentially even after the pandemic? We've seen the flouting of rules not just in Israel, but in New York and even in Melbourne, Australia. And as you said, we've seen Haredi communities really suffering higher percentages of infection than in surrounding areas. And even today, we've seen certain areas of Jerusalem, or Haredi suburbs basically, being put on a different regime of restrictions than other areas. How's that going to play out in society?
There definitely is that risk, Ginette, and that's something which concerns all of us. I understand someone sitting back and watching the news and seeing that, I don't know what the number is at this point, but 3/4 of the cases in Israel are from the ultra-Orthodox population, the very high numbers and the percentages. And you say to yourself, my goodness, if it wasn't for this population, Israel would be in a completely different place. And yes, as you mentioned today, they did put basically what's called a Seder in Hebrew, basically a complete lockdown around various areas, especially in Jerusalem, to try to contain the spread of the virus. There was a real fear, and there was definitely, you heard very harsh negative rhetoric in Israel. It was from some news personalities on national TV against the ultra-Orthodox population. And I believe that is the wrong response. I certainly believe, let's see how we can fix things so that if God forbid we ever experience anything like this in the future, it won't happen again, where an entire population or a large population is cut off from the information and not following the rules as quickly as everyone else. But my Rabbi Baumbach's message is the critical one, and that is the mistake of taking groups within a population and then saying that's the entire population. And that's the fear. Huge percentages of the ultra-Orthodox population did keep to the rules. And it is difficult for them not to have been in yeshiva, not to have been in synagogue, and this entire shakeup to their way of life. And to focus on, there are extremists who were not keeping to the rules, or even now today. And that's horrible. We should all speak out against those groups. The police should come out extremely hard against anyone who's endangering others' lives or their own lives. And that's the way we should view it. So hopefully all of us can work together to make sure that the rhetoric is not anti-religious, anti the ultra-Orthodox, but try to find a way for everyone to work together to get through this situation. And then when it's over, let's try to repair what has been damaged and try to make sure that we don't have this kind of problem in the future.
Yeah, definitely a task for the future, definitely on the to-do list. Speaking of unity, let's talk about national unity. Let's get into a bit of politics here. So the 2nd of March elections, round 3, didn't really seem to get us too far. And then came COVID-19. And we saw Kahol Lavan split, and we saw Gantz and Netanyahu starting to negotiate a new coalition of national unity. Can you explain to us, because, we had 3 days, or I certainly had 3 days where I wasn't getting any news, and a lot of catch up to do when I turn my phone back on after Chag. Where are the negotiations at the moment? What's the story? What's the lie of the land from where you sit?
So at the moment, as we speak, and I'm going to go backwards a little bit, while we speak right now, there's no real negotiations going on. There's little messages that are being sent through the media, and that's not negotiations. Essentially, going up to Pesach, we thought we were on the right path in terms, I say right path just because I personally do believe the best thing for Israel is the widest government possible now, help us get through this crisis and the healing of some of the wounds amongst the population from a year of elections. And we were on our way. There was a rotation agreed to. Netanyahu would be prime minister for the first 18 months until September 2021. And Gantz, until that point, would be deputy prime minister and defense minister. And then in 2021, in September, there would be a change, a shocking change for Israel, as Netanyahu would leave his position as prime minister. He would become a deputy prime minister, and Gantz would become the prime minister. And they worked out more or less a lot of the details in terms of the ministries and some of the policies issues. Gantz, for example, had compromised, and he said that he would allow Israel to move forward with annexation of areas of the West Bank with American support. And there was a lot of progress that was made. And then at the last moment, as we headed towards Pesach, there was a breakdown. The breakdown, just so everyone who's listening and watching can understand, is over the issue of the appointment of judges. Likud wanted to make sure that even though there was going to be a blue and white justice minister, that they could change some of the rules to make sure that conservative judges are appointed to the bench. And blue and white and Gantz said, no, we're not going to allow that change to take place. And that led to the two sides essentially breaking off the talks. Netanyahu called Gantz right before the holiday and wished him a happy holiday and said, let's talk after the holiday. Everyone was analyzing, what does after the holiday mean? Does it mean after the first day of the holiday? Does it mean after the 7 days of the holiday? At the moment, they are not talking. Today is a day where Gantz is expected to formally ask for an extension. He was given 28 days from President Rivlin to form a government. That ends tomorrow. And he's going to ask for a 2-week extension. And the president has to decide, is he going to give him that extension to try to form a government or not? Or will he hand the mandate to form a government over to Netanyahu and give him the chance to do so? All of this is somewhat semantics because they're talking about a unity government. That's the only option that exists. But there's one important technicality regarding who has the mandate to form a government. Whoever has the mandate to form the government, his party is given control of the Knesset Arrangements Committee. They have control over basically what happens within the Knesset. And why is that important? And I'm getting into a lot of inside talk over here, but it's important for everybody to understand what's happening behind the scenes. That's important because the threat that Gantz has against Netanyahu, if he won't form a unity government, is that he will move forward with legislation to make it illegal for Netanyahu to be prime minister at this time while being under indictment. And Gantz only has that threat if he has control over the Knesset. If Netanyahu is given the mandate to form a government and Likud gets control of that committee, there's no longer any pressure on Netanyahu to work quickly to form a new government. And therefore, that's the battle that we're going through right now. Who will Rivlin give the mandate to? Will he give Gantz an extra 2 weeks and he'll have 2 more weeks controlling the Knesset? Or will it go to Likud and then they'll have control over the Knesset? One more point that I'll mention, we have polls. We have polls. If Israel would go to a 4th election, as shocking as that sounds, what would the results be? But Ginette, you have to hear these results. Likud, 42 seats, with a right-wing religious government at 63 without any effort whatsoever. Netanyahu's popularity is at, his rating is at 70% for how he's handled this crisis. And there would be a right-wing religious government without even any issue. Gantz would have 18 seats. Yesh Atid, which is leading the opposition now, would go down to 9 seats. So everybody on the center left does not want to go to another election. My hope is that over the next few weeks, they will find a way to come together and we will have a broad unity government, a wide-ranging government in the 70s in terms of the number of seats. Most importantly, for this immediate crisis, Israel, like the rest of the world, we're facing an economic and health crisis like we've never experienced before. And you have to have a strong, permanent government in place to deal with it. So hopefully they'll find some way to bridge these gaps and we'll be on our way towards a unity government. And I hope that's where we're heading.
Yeah, I hope so too. It's nothing if not complicated, isn't it? But what compromises do you think that each of Bibi and Benny would have to make for this coalition, for this national unity coalition to work?
There's significant compromises from both sides. For just as an example, for Likud, Ayelet Shaked had been the previous justice minister, right-wing, conservative. She was making all kinds of changes. And now the Blue and White asked for their MK, Avi Nissenkorn, who was the former head of the unions in Israel, far left, to be the justice minister. Likud has apparently agreed to that compromise, but they want to have a say in a lot of the policies. I don't know who's going to give in on that one or not. Benny Gantz had to make a very difficult decision to compromise on the issue of annexation in the West Bank. And Likud was insisting on this very hard. And apparently he has agreed to that compromise. So the one major issue right now, which apparently from everyone I'm speaking to is holding back moving forward with a government, is the issue of how involved will Likud be in the process of appointing justices. That seems to be the number one issue. They want to make changes to the system. Blue and White does not. And Blue and White says, we will not compromise on this issue. So the question is, who's going to give in? I will tell you, just as an outsider watching, I do believe that at this point, Likud holds all the cards, because going to a 4th election just as a shoo-in at this point for Netanyahu, at least according to the polls, and it would be a real risk for Blue and White to get to that point. I do believe that they'll try to find some way, some language to make everyone happy on that issue. But apparently they've worked out ministries. And by the way, we're talking about a very large government. I don't believe that's the best thing. 30 ministers, possibly larger. There's no need, especially in an economic crisis, for a government of that size. But apparently that's what was needed to be done to make all sides happy. So we'll see. But the number one issue that's going to require compromise right now is on the issue of justices, of the issue of how to find a mechanism for more conservative judges to be on the court that doesn't allow blue and white to feel that the process has been tilted completely in Likud's direction.
Okay. So your opinion, Dov, I think I know what your answer is going to be, but in a few words, is Gantz a courageous hero, or is he an opportunistic traitor for leaving his party and joining a coalition?
I strongly believe a courageous leader. He understands that it's possible that his entire political future is finished if this doesn't work out. People do see him having crossed over, so to speak, to the other side. He was in a campaign where the entire campaign he was talking about, we cannot serve with Netanyahu. He's corrupt. He's under indictment, and we can't allow this to happen. But yet, especially given the coronavirus crisis, he made the decision Israel cannot go to a fourth election. No one on either side was able to form a government. And he made the decision that he will serve under Netanyahu for these 18 months and run the risk of what happens if the government falls apart before he becomes prime minister. I believe Israel really needed this to happen. We need to have a government. It's good to see a government that includes people on the right wing and people on the left wing. And it's as wide as they were able to make it. I'm sad. As someone who used to be a member of Yesh Atid, I'm sad that Yesh Atid and Yair Lapid did not join this government. I believe Yair Lapid would have been foreign minister. He could have been a very good foreign minister for Israel. I think that would have been the wide tent that Israel really needed at this time. And I understand the value of not wanting to serve with a prime minister who's under indictment. I do. Well, I do believe, on the one hand, innocent until proven guilty, and that's what the courts are for. But there is an example that you want to show for a country. And why would you want a prime minister who's going to trial while he's serving as prime minister? But Gantz saw this moment, and he saw that the only option was heading to a fourth election. And he said, we cannot do this as a country. Israel, at this point, with everything that's happening, to have the chaos of a fourth election, not to have a permanent government, would have been a disaster. And Gantz made the decision. I don't know what will happen. I don't know. Will I end up being prime minister in this rotation? Will this government last? What will my future be? But this is what I believe Israel needs at this time. And therefore, I certainly side with courageous leader. And I'm very proud and happy that he made this decision. Now let's just hope they can bridge these gaps and actually form the government.
Great, thank you. And you mentioned, just cycling back, you mentioned that you were a member for Yesh Atid, a Knesset member for Yesh Atid. What's your opinion of the likely future position of Yesh Atid, of Yair Lapid in opposition, and indeed for the future of the Yesh Atid party and the left-wing parties in Israel?
So you talk about the left-wing parties in Israel. The Labor Party, which established the state of Israel, Ben-Gurion, no longer exists. They just joined together with Blue and White. Their seats are officially part of Blue and White. There is no Labor Party running in a next election in Israel. That's a shocking development. Israel, over the last few decades, has shifted rightward. A country where a majority was always willing to give up land that's very dear to us and make significant compromises for peace, feels that it's been burned through these processes. Burned through Oslo, where the Palestinian Authority was given weapons, which were then used in terror attacks. Burned after Camp David in 2000, when Ehud Barak made compromises that no American leader ever expected an Israeli leader to make. And Yasser Arafat not only said no, but unleashed the second intifada, where buses were blowing up and pizza parlors are blowing up in Israel. Burned after the disengagement in 2005, where we pulled completely out of the Gaza Strip, hoping that the Palestinians would turn it into a wonderful state and area for themselves. And instead, it was taken over by Hamas and used as a launching pad for 15,000 rockets at Israel. Israel has seen how all of its gestures have failed and only hurt us in the long run. And therefore, Israel has certainly shifted rightward. That's why, by the way, even Yesh Atid won't call themselves left. They're a center party. Gantz calls himself a center party. Yair Lapid is going to be the head of the opposition. And that certainly gives him a position where he speaks in the Knesset, he meets with visiting leaders, he gets security updates, and he wants to position himself as the alternative to the Likud-led government. The problem is just the polls don't indicate that Israel's buying into that. I mentioned to you before, if elections were held today, Likud 42, Yesh Atid at 9. I don't know what Yair Lapid could possibly do as an opposition leader to raise their number of mandates and get people who are more on the right to shift over. So I do believe there'll be a party. And by the way, they have good members of Knesset who will do good things. And I think they'll try to pass laws that are helpful to Israel. But in terms of becoming an alternative, becoming a prime minister candidate, I just don't see that happening at this point. I think that Likud really has a monopoly on that at this point, given where the Israeli population is, both ideologically and where they see their strong leaders coming from.
Okay, so just how stable do you think a unity government coalition would be post-corona? How long is that coalition going to last, if indeed it's established?
There are a lot of experts from behind the scenes who are saying we're going to go to elections in a year anyway, so it's not going to, it's not going to last. It's not going to work. I don't know the answer to that. I personally do hope for Israel that it does reach that stage where Gantz replaces Netanyahu. I think it's a good thing for Israelis to see someone else in the position of prime minister. I hear all the time as I go through the streets of Israel, people saying, no one else can be prime minister besides Netanyahu. And I'm not discounting all the good that he's done. I do believe he's done wonderful things for Israel throughout his years as prime minister. But the notion that no one else can do the job is something which I reject. I believe there are people in many parties that can become prime minister and can lead the country very well. Within Netanyahu's Likud party, there are certainly very qualified candidates to replace him. I believe that Benny Gantz as well will do a good job leading the country. So I just hope for Israel's sake that it reaches that point. Will there be issues of contention where Likud is pushing for various issues and Gantz can't say yes to it and it will fall apart? It's a real possibility. I believe that'll be a very bad thing for Israel. I hope this government can last as long as possible. I will throw out one more thing though, Ginette, just for you to hear, and that is next spring, there's elections for president of Israel. And there are some little rumors around that part of this coalition deal is that Gantz and his party would support Benjamin Netanyahu for president of Israel. And then Gantz would take over at that point. And then Netanyahu has another gig for the next 7 years, take him off to the sunset as the president of Israel. I don't know if that's going to happen, but it is something which is definitely being talked about here and there in corners of the Knesset. So we'll have to see what happens in terms of the stability of the government. But I just see from your reaction, what a development that would be.
Indeed. Like people might think about jobs for the boys, but let's leave the commentary aside. I'm going to give you a few questions from our listening audience and watching audience, and thank you for those, ladies and gentlemen, and please keep them coming on Facebook feed. From Abe Weisberger in Melbourne, if we go to a fourth election, will it be quick? And
that's a great question.
Maybe something about the logistics. How, if it's quick, how on earth would there be a fourth election in lockdown?
Yeah, the fourth election is going to be in September. There's a whole, we all go to an election, Netanyahu will be given the chance to form a government. That's another 28 days. After he fails, then it goes to the Knesset, and there's 21 days for the Knesset to try to find one person. And then at that point, at whatever point it all falls apart and there's a law passed in the Knesset that says that we're going to another election, or if it's triggered automatically, it's 3 months until the election. So by the time this all plays out and the 3 months kick in, we're talking about September, and the interim government would continue in the meantime. Remember, Netanyahu has a 70% positive rating for his handling of this crisis. People certainly see him as a leader. I will tell you, I sit down with my family, we watch his press conference, put aside all politics. You do feel like someone's guiding you and leading you and understanding the issues. I will tell you, Naftali Bennett, who is defense minister now, again, put all politics aside. I think people are seeing someone who has studied the issues and is trying to govern in his role in a very strong way. So there's a feeling like, maybe we're managing this okay, and maybe we'll get through this. The problem is more on a budget level. To pass new budgets and to get to the point where we have all the emergency budgets that we need to really get through this, you really do have to have a permanent government in place. Because right now we're just going on past budgets that were passed. It's very difficult to make the adjustments that need to be made for a crisis like this. But in theory, that's how it would work. It would work that Gantz has his time to form a government. He fails. Netanyahu has his chance. Let's assume that he fails. The Knesset has its chance. And then elections are called for 3 months after that. I can't even imagine what those elections would look like because you no longer have the mammoth blue and white with Gantz, Lapid, Ya'alon, and Ashkenazi as a real alternative to Likud. Likud's really the only game in town at that point because the highest is 18 of blue and white and Gantz. I just don't see how it would even be an election campaign of any kind when everyone knows that Netanyahu is going to be the candidate for prime minister. Remember also, Netanyahu's trial begins at the end of May. So that also has to be woven into all of this. You're going to have a country dealing with the corona crisis, dealing with a prime minister going to trial and elections. It would just be something which I cannot believe we would have to live through. And that's why I do believe at the end of the day, somehow or another, someone's going to compromise to enable this unity government to come forward. They're so close. They've overcome so many of the other gaps along the way. So hopefully they'll be able to close that gap. By the way, Ginette, I want to mention one more thing. Many people said that we'll get to September 2021 when Netanyahu is supposed to step down and maybe he'll just collapse the government then, pull Likud out of the government and then force an election without Gantz being prime minister. Apparently, the agreement they've worked out says that when Netanyahu is sworn in to be prime minister for this new government, Gantz will be sworn in at that point to be prime minister in September 2021. There will be some mechanism to make sure that he's automatically prime minister at that point. So we'll have to see which direction it goes. But I think the question that was asked by Abe is a good one. It would be chaotic to have the elections, and there is no mechanism in place for a speedy election. They tried last time, they explored it. It's not simple, and I think it would just play out if, God forbid, this happens, and it would be an election in September.
Yeah, and with the restrictions of some sort of lockdown, it could be even more complicated. Another last question, perhaps on straight politics from Jack Craypot. Here's a nice one for you, Dov. Would you consider running for Knesset again? Or perhaps we should rephrase it as, under what conditions would you consider running for Knesset again?
I appreciate the question. I must say that I've enjoyed my time outside of Knesset, certainly in terms of family time, and I've been blessed to be able to use the platform as a former member of Knesset to be able to be out there advocating for Israel, educating for Israel. Now I'm doing that under the auspices of honest reporting and speaking to delegations all the time, both here and abroad. Thank God I've had the opportunity to write as well. I just put out a book on the Chumash, on the weekly Parsha. I'm finishing a book now for honest reporting about Israel advocacy, a book that anyone who wants to be able to be an advocate for Israel, especially students going to college campuses, needs to read. Just the basics they need to have to be able to make the case for Israel. So I've enjoyed the break, especially this last year with the 3 elections. Very happy that I'm not part of it. It's possible that in the future, an opportunity might come along where I feel like I have the opportunity to make a real difference. I would definitely explore it. But I talk about it very often with some of my colleagues who are former members. We're free from the politics. We're able to do a lot of good with the platform as a former member without having to be involved and restricted significantly by the political world. So it's not something which I'm running back to do. If I called my wife to the screen now, she would definitely say, it's not something which we see in the near future. But if the right opportunity came along where I felt that I could make a difference in a significant way, more than I'm doing now as a former member, I would definitely explore it. But thank God there's plenty of good work to do for Israel and the Jewish people without having to be involved in the craziness of the Knesset itself.
Great. So that takes us to, in a natural way, to a next topic of discussion, which is about honest reporting and your work there. Social media has long been a natural home for extremists and crazies on all sides. It basically gives them carte blanche to write anything they like, to be anonymous, to be these cowardly little keyboard warriors with no accountability and no one stopping them in pretty much inciting hatred and violence. And now being locked down at home, they've got even more time to spend online. So we've heard a little bit about some really, really destructive and insidious anti-Semitic corona conspiracies. We've heard about Zoom bombing, where there's anti-Israel and anti-Semitic diatribes just flashing into people's learning sessions and meetings and things like that. Can you tell us from your position in honest reporting about some of the things that you've seen and some of the ways that honest reporting is dealing with that?
Yeah, we've definitely seen an increase in anti-Semitic rhetoric online, that's for sure. You mentioned in terms of Zoom, natural flow of anti-Semitism is blame the Jews for the virus. We definitely, again, because we have enough footage out there of the Orthodox population in particular in New York and Israel, it's an opportunity for anti-Semites to flex their muscles and really be out there. We have found ourselves on basically 3 different tracks, I think I would call it, at honest reporting. One is having to put out material regularly to fight against that, to expose it, to make people aware of it. That's part one. That's just for the general public. Putting out videos. We're on a process right now where we're hoping to get to 20 million views in terms of getting the information out there, fighting against the anti-Semitism, targeting the ages of 18 to 35, where we know that that's the most important age to reach, to get the information out there, to let people see, be aware of the anti-Semitism and speak out against it. That's stage 1. Stage 2 is about Israel. Where we'll see Reuters as an example talk about what's happening in Gaza with the virus and somehow implicating Israel in being responsible for the siege of Gaza without any context whatsoever. If you want to explain that Gaza has restrictions as to what goes in and out because of the fact that they are led by Hamas, who's trying to smuggle in weapons to shoot at Israel and kill Israelis, you put it into the context, then you can at least have a fair conversation. Explain what Israel is doing to make sure that there are medical needs and humanitarian needs getting into Gaza. And most importantly, to talk about the cooperation between Israel and the Palestinian leaders. That's not being talked about. All that's being talked about is the sad plight of Palestinians. And I agree, by the way, with the sad plight of the Palestinians. We're not countering that story, but let's put everything into a context and also make sure we show what Israel is doing. But number 3, the government press office has not really been able to be fully functional during this time. So we've been working very hard to basically play that role. We have a Media Central project where we're working with hundreds of journalists who are stationed in Israel to make sure that they get almost daily phone conversations with them, phone conferences, to give them the real story about what's happening in Israel. And that way, when you see an article in the New York Times or in the Wall Street Journal and other outlets, it's being fed from the information that we're giving them, and we're able to track those. So our activity actually as honest reporting has increased over the last few weeks, fighting the anti-Semitism, fighting the anti-Israel rhetoric, and making sure that the journalists can get the truth behind the story. And we're living in a time where so many people find themselves, not as productive or not at work. We're finding ourselves almost extending ourselves beyond the norm to make sure that we can keep up with, sadly, the anti-Semitism, the anti-Israel rhetoric, and the untruth or the mistruths or the lack of information in the stories about what's happening in Israel.
Yeah, well, kol hakavod on the excellent work of honest reporting. We are good friends of honest reporting at the ZFA, and we're happy that you're there as well. Another question from the audience, Dov. It seems that countries might become more insular after the pandemic. Certainly borders are going to close. People are going, even in Australia, they're saying, plan your next holiday, whenever that might be, within Australia. There's no talk of international travel, and it's certainly going to be a long, long time before we start thinking about cruising again, that's for sure. But where countries are going to be looking at being more self-reliant, looking at building up the domestic capabilities, etc. Is Israel going to be in that place as well, or do you think they're going to have a more global external outlook?
I think that on the one hand, you're going to see significant restrictions in Israel and rules in place, perhaps even stricter than the rest of the world, with regards to those who are coming into Israel. Israel was one of the first to actually have rules in place on that front, and they were initially criticized for it. But I think that other countries are certainly going to follow that example. I'm hearing in Israel talks of the first opening of the doors for flights to come in being September, the earliest, and I don't even know if that will be the time. And we'll have to see what restrictions are put on those who want to come in to Israel once that time comes to place. But I do believe what Israel wants to try to do is whatever Israel can give to the rest of the world, we would like to give, whether that's in terms of treatments and antibiotics and whatever Israel can do to help the world. Once we get things under control here, I think we're going to want to project to the rest of the world, and I hope that it can work that way. There's an opportunity here for countries around the world to help each other, and whichever country comes up with the cure or the treatment for it, that we'll all be able to help each other. I know that Israel, we're starting now with taking the blood plasma from those who have survived the virus to now put it into those who are suffering from it, and I think that Israel might lead the way on that front. But Israel will 100%, and I think Netanyahu or whoever prime minister is, have shown we want to take care of Israel first. And even if that means shutting the borders and shutting things down for a period of time, we're going to do so. So it's going to have to be this balance. Israel thrives off tourism. We thrive off people of the world from all faiths coming to the Holy Land. Today we're celebrating, on the one hand, we have Pesach, we have Easter. I know that there was all kinds of questions about Ramadan coming up in terms of the Muslim faith, and we're proud to be this center for faiths around the world, and we don't want to create a scenario where people can't come on their pilgrimages, but the first concern is going to have to be making sure that Israel is taken care of. I also imagine a scenario of Israel analyzing what other countries have or haven't done within their borders, and then making an analysis based on that. Who can come into Israel, who cannot, who will have to go into quarantine once they come here. But one thing is for sure, Israel from the very beginning was very strict about this. And even as we, God willing, leave at some point this situation, I think Israel will continue to be extremely strict about it. The one thing I'll mention, Ginette, I know that you're aware of this in Australia, has been Israel's policies about Israelis coming home. That's been really remarkable to see how, if there's a group of Israelis anywhere around the world who want to come back to Israel, Israel has gone out of their way to make sure they come back to Israel and be here, be with their families, be in their homeland during this crisis. And that's something which has been inspirational to see from the Israeli side.
Absolutely. And at the ZFA, we've been very, very aware and involved with those El Al flights that have come to Australia. It's been something that's been on our agenda as Australians for a long time, or on our wish list, to see a direct flight, a non-stop flight from Israel to Australia. And in the last 3 weeks, we had one to Perth and one to Melbourne. Now, we never wanted it to happen in these circumstances, but it's happened now. So we're really hopeful that in the fullness of time, whenever that might be, when it's safe to travel, that's going to be a regular flight. And for those of us who live in Australia, and Dov, next time you come to visit us, you'll be able to take one flight direct from Tel Aviv to Melbourne, and one flight for, say, 17 hours instead of numerous stopovers and that exhausting 34-hour or whatever it is, door-to-door trip.
I definitely hope I definitely hope that's an outcome. And Ginette, I would welcome the opportunity to come back and not have to do this via Zoom, but be able
Yeah.
to meet with your incredible, incredible community in person.
Yeah, thank you. And we would look forward to having that. And I guess it brings us back to the beginning of our conversation and back to Pesach, I suppose, Dov. It is a time where we relish human contact. We relish that face to face, the hugs and the food and the sharing and the bickering and the why do I have to do all the dishes conversations that this year didn't happen. So that's on the good side, I suppose. But if you can just close us off, Dov, perhaps with a message about Pesach, with a message about what again, let's finish on a note of optimism of what we're going to get out of this and what this festival of freedom and liberation really means to us today.
I think that when you study the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and you see a people who were in complete and total despair. I mean, you read the teachings about what was happening in Egypt, and they were assimilating, they were becoming part of Egypt, they had no hope, the numbers that were being killed, the catastrophe that was taking place. And then, just like this, a moment can come and God is able to help us and bring us to the best of times as we go towards Sinai and go towards the land of Israel. And that story for our people has repeated itself numerous times throughout our history. You talk about going from the Holocaust to the state of Israel. What greater example can there be of the worst catastrophe to this incredible spark of light in our history? I think for myself, my grandmother, who just passed away a few months ago, she was in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and she sat in my Knesset office 70 years after her liberation, and with a grandson as a member of Knesset in the Jewish state in Jerusalem in our parliament. We live in a time where we know that change is possible, and that we can leave an experience even stronger. Sadly, we have sacrifices along the way, and we don't minimize them at all, but somehow we emerge stronger and even greater and even more unified and even more spiritual as a people. That is the story of Pesach. That's the story that we've told on Seder night for thousands of years. And we know it reinforces our belief in God and our belief that God is the one who is able to heal us and to cure us. And what we need to do is each person their own way, find a way that they can change themselves. Something small about myself that I'm learning from this experience, and I can leave this experience stronger and better. And then collectively, if all of us do that, we will emerge stronger and we will emerge as a better people. And that's the way I look at it. Just keep reminding ourselves about Pesach, about God's promise that he's always there for us, no matter what we go through. And somehow we will find ourselves as a stronger people. And I'm saying that in Israel, with the chaotic political system, with all the craziness that we've been through, but I don't have a doubt that we'll be able to emerge on the other side of this in this way. The most important thing is that we keep to our faith and that we stay unified together as a people. And we find ways, just like we're doing now, to remain together, remain talking to one another. And I want to say again, I believe that your Zionist Federation and Zionism in Australia is an example of how people can be geographically far away from Israel, but so close and so with us every step of the way. And as long as we continue with that together, nothing can stop us as a people. And God willing, we'll see much brighter and stronger times ahead.
Dov, thank you so much. What a beautiful motif to end on. Really, really appreciate your time today, your insights and your analysis. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure everybody who's been watching tonight will agree with me. I'm going to say thank you to you and flip back to Bren to close us off here. Thanks, Bren.
Ginette, thank you so much. Dov, thanks again. That was just wonderful to have you on. I just want to say very quickly to those who were cut off at the very beginning, there was some sort of technical glitch. I don't quite know how that happened, but we managed to get back on Facebook. Just one of the wonders of modern technology. But either way, thank you so much for tuning in. It was It was a great evening, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. As I said, next week we will have the theme of Yom HaShoah. But until then, have a wonderful conclusion of Pesach. Have a very peaceful and healthy week, and we will see you next week. Thank you very much.